Hi, here we are, week 9, looking at formal organizations. Really what the focus will be is what is a formal organization, and particularly we're going to focus on bureaucracies. What are bureaucracies? How are they structured? What are their strengths and what are their weaknesses, shortcomings? And we'll look at a particular form of bureaucracy called McDonaldization and what are the strengths and weaknesses of that. And we'll just touch on just briefly just an element about where is bureaucracies going in the future. Alright, this will be the second part of this chapter. Hope you're enjoying it. I hope you get something out of this, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Bye now.
Okay, let's look at formal organizations then. Now, formal organizations are highly structured secondary groups for the purposes of achieving specific goals, and they're the most in the most efficient manner, as is the game plan. So when you think about this organization, you sort of see it as a hierarchy, and there's fewer people at the top as there is at the bottom. Now, bureaucracies are organizational model characterized by a hierarchy of authority, which is what that triangle represents, and it has a clear division of labor. It has very explicit rules about who does what under what circumstances, and there are procedures about how to do things. And also in bureaucracies, there's this element of impersonality in personal matters. That is to say, don't worry, it's not personal, it's just business. Well, it might be personal, but we're not going to treat it that way, and that's what impersonality means. And we're going to look at the characteristics and the shortcomings of bureaucracy as well. We're also going to look at McDonaldization. Okay, so when we think about formal organizations, you can consider corporations, schools, government agencies, police services, hospitals, all as being a part of this. So let's look at characteristics of bureaucracies. What are they? Now, we're going to look at what they are. So for the foremost, formal characteristics, highly organized, they're efficient, productivity is salient, and what is it that bureaucracies strive for? So when we think about bureaucracies, one of the first things we come up with is the division of labor. Each member has a specific status, each member has certain assigned tasks to fulfill, that each person needs to fulfill their tasks in order for the full project or full function to be completed. It requires the employment of specialized experts who are responsible for the effective performance of their duties. So everybody who has a role has to be fulfilling a specific role, and that some roles are more specialized than others and need higher education, perhaps in some cases, in order to do those roles, and other roles maybe need less qualifications, in which case the people hired meet those expectations. So, for example, in college, you have people who are involved in terms of the division of labor who are administrators, you have CEOs, you have deans, you have academic deans, you have administrative deans, you have associate deans, and you have coordinators. You have support people, and they're involved with providing services, whether that be student services or administrative services. And then you have faculty, both part-time, full-time, sessional, partial load, all parts of these divisions of labor. Everybody has a role and responsibility, and varying degrees of responsibility requiring varying degrees of education, but all have to fulfill those responsibilities in an effective performance of those duties in order to achieve the overall expectations of what this bureaucracy is intended to achieve, educating students. Now, when you add to that, you have, there we go, hierarchy of authority. You have some people's responsibility are higher up the chain of command, that is based on each lower office being under the control or supervision of a higher one. So when you saw that the first slide in the first image of president and then vices and secretaries and treasurers and such, everybody, there's a hierarchy of authority. There's fewer at the top and there's more at the bottom. So there's few people in the top administrative roles at, say, a college, and there's quite a few more people who are in different degrees of holding that base up, whether they be involved in maintenance, whether they be involved in the delivery of teaching, whether they be involved in the support of students in the libraries. Everybody has a degree of authority, a reporting mechanism who they need to report to and who's responsible for what group of people. Then we have the third piece, which are rules and regulations. This is the standardized rules and regulations establishing authority within an organization, who can do what, under what circumstances, who can't do this, and who must do this, and who's responsible for these elements of this overall bureaucracy. And are usually provided to members within a written format. Now, normally within this area, you would get a job description. You might have a code of conduct associated with a job, the policies and principles. Frequently, when you start a new job with an organization, you'll be asked to become familiar with the policies and principles. You'll be given a binder that indicates what are the policies and policies and principles of an organization. So you become familiar with them, and it's your responsibility to adhere to them and fulfill your duties with this as your underlying or underpinning rules and regulations. The fourth is qualification-based employment. And really what's going on here is that the organization hires staff members and professional employees based on specific qualifications. Individual performance is evaluated against specific standards, and promotions are based on merit, as spelled out by the personnel policies. So, you're getting education now so that you will qualify for the type of employment that you want. So if you're going into nursing, you can't go and get a job as a nurse without first getting qualified to be a nurse. If you're going into the marine industry, you can't start navigating a boat or working in the engine room until you've met the base qualifications for that employment by getting the proper education and preparing you for that. And so all of that gets done, and it enables the bureaucracy to run more efficiently. You're not getting people who are unqualified doing very qualified jobs, therefore slowing the whole process down. And then lastly is impersonality. And this is the interactions that's based on your status and based on a standardized means of communicating and standardized criteria rather than personal feelings or subjective factors. It's just business. It's not personal, it's just business. It might feel personal, but in a bureaucracy, it's all about getting it's goal-oriented, not worrying about whether you're feeling good about this or not worrying if your toes are sore from having been stepped on. It's about meeting the objectives, meeting the goal, not about whether or not everybody is happy. And that's typical of a lot of organizations and a lot of bureaucracies. Now, what we've described here is the formal characteristics of a bureaucracy, but there are informal structures in bureaucracies. And these informal structures can be described differently. These organizations are made of people, so bureaucracies, whether they're organized and tight and hierarchical or not, they still have people. They're not categories. And so each bureaucracy has an informal structure. The informal structure might be, hey, drop in anytime, my door is always open. It's composed of those aspects of participants' day-to-day activities, the interactions that ignore or bypass or do not even correspond with the official rules and procedures of bureaucracy. However, that might be the written, your door is always open. The reality is it's not open when I need it to be open to share information or thoughts. So the informal structure can be equated to the culture of an organization. And sometimes the culture is not the same as what is written on paper. You might find at times that organizations have the formal culture, the formal structure, and then they have an informal structure, the way that business is done. Now, some shortcomings to bureaucracies. Well, let's look at some of the shortcomings. One is inefficiency and rigidity. This is a self-protective behavior where upper management or upper levels and they have a tendency to keep information close to them. So this blockage of information leads to monopolization of that information by the upper levels. There's upper levels have information that the lower levels don't have, and if they had it, they might be able to do a better job. So there's a tendency that can result in workers and management working at cross purposes. If workers don't have all the information, how are they supposed to be able to do the job better if upper management is keeping that information to themselves, and then the information that they've kept, they're wondering why workers aren't doing a good enough job. And so that inefficiency and rigidity about separating the purposes and cross-purposing, workers from management. There's also resistance to change, and this is where organizations can be resistant to make very difficult, very important changes, but can be difficult for organizations to adapt to new circumstances. It's made up a lot of people, and some people get very staid in the way that they do things, and they get comfortable, and so they tend to be resistant to change. This is partly due to the distance between management and workers, resulting in limited communication. And then one of the other elements about bureaucracies is that because they are made up of people and because they can be inefficient and rigid and resistant to change, there's a tendency to perpetuate inequities between gender, race, and class, because even though times change and their demographic changes, the way that they do business oftentimes is much slower to change, and it has a tendency to perpetuate existing inequities. Now, we'll look at this from a different perspective here. The characters that Weber idealized in bureaucracy really put things into a hierarchy, and this is one way you can view that. Now, the inefficiencies sit in the background, and organizational structure sit in the foreground. And okay, now I'm going to leave it at that. Now, one of the things that was built off of Weber's characteristics of bureaucracy was something that was introduced as the elements of McDonaldization. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I think it was Ritzer, where he looked at McDonaldization as having this process by which the principles of the fast food restaurant are becoming to be dominant more in more sectors of American society. And this is Ritzer who was indicating this. And he looked at McDonaldization to have these efficiencies like an assembly line, that everyone had a specific job and that everyone did it in the specific order. And by doing so, it became very predictable. And so part of the elements of McDonaldization included this assembly line efficiency. Calculability was the emphasis that was put on speed and quantity rather than quality. So how fast can we do it? You see it in a lot of fast food places, Tim Hortons included, for example, is that they'll have everybody on a clock. How long does it take to take the order and then deliver the product? As being part of the calculability and taking this standard of quantity and speed rather than quality. The predictability feature is that the more predictable menus become and the more scripted the interaction between customer and employee, the better the predictability that the person comes to expect in a very predictable product. It's standardized, it's scripted, it's what you'd expect, and no surprises. And customers come used to doing that, but businesses are starting to do that more and more as well. And then this element of control, where individual workers have very little to no say in the operation of the business. They basically do what they're asked to do. There's not a lot of variation in what you do, and no one's given a lot of individual responsibility where they might have input that they can offer that would make a difference. And then lastly, the irrationalities of rationalizing. This is the dehumanizing for both the customer and the worker. This is where all the interactions seem to be nonsensical. It doesn't matter that the customer is not entirely happy with everything, as long as they're getting their product quickly, and as long as they're getting it enough of it, then we're not really caring about as much about how they feel about things either. So this is an argument that Ritzer had around where bureaucracies have been moving toward, is this sort of fast food approach. So in the future, what do we think there might be? Well, it's hard to say, but the movement appears that the changes will occur in response to macro-sociological changes. That is, some broad changes or macro changes may occur. Things like globalization. It's already fully enforced, but the effects of globalization, having companies all over the world sharing information and housed in one country and having work shipped out to other areas and then shipping the finished product back. whether it's people around the table and from different geographic areas, all contributing to the value and the significance of, and in some cases the shortcomings of that product innovation. Technical innovation, where we start seeing more and more interactivity happening with that way that products are being done. You see this occurring already, that organizations are more global and are more innovative, whether they're taking advantage of some innovation based on either poor quality worker support and wages and health and safety concerns, or whether they're starting to ramp up to have quicker and more rapid access to materials and therefore an ability to deliver their products more quickly and more rapidly, because a lot of the businesses are moving towards or taking advantage of information technology as being a product, then more innovation in terms of how to deliver that, including, for example, some of the surgeries that are being taking advantage of the expertise of a very few people around the world to be able to use online surgery that's done across the internet. So I'm in one room in North America using a robot to move instruments that are in another country somewhere else. I'm doing surgery across the ocean without going across the ocean myself. And then lastly would be this increased prevalence in the service economy, with all the innovation moving towards more internet and multimedia and social media focus. More focus is also being put on this service economy. And so we have a lot of potential in terms of where is it going, and that comes with its own headaches and shortcomings. Some of the new organizations that could be starting to emerge would be networks and network enterprises. Networks are, they work within the motives and decisions and actions flow from ever more fluid yet ever-present networks. They're continually changing. They're always growing and being innovated. It's the network, not the bureaucracy or the family, that gets things done. For example, the production of open source software such as Linux operating system and Firefox internet browser. These products are created by a network of people who work together with no expectation for profit. And they're not in one location. They are all over the world. They are you, they are I. And some special cases of networks would be Al-Qaeda terrorists and the likes, or the illicit drugs that get in the fields and cocoa fields in Colombia and the poppy fields of Afghanistan to the streets of our cities. And that's done through more complex networks as well. Now, network enterprises, these are businesses which can be companies or parts of companies that join together for specific projects and become the focus of a network. Some of the elements of this is increased flexibility. One can select and change network partners based on cost, efficiency, and technical innovations. Some of the examples of network enterprises, the combination of Ford and Toyota and the Dell computers, and how they interact, not as those three together, but Ford and Toyota work together. Dell has its network enterprise. The keys to success is the global internet, the ability to work over and around the world for different parts of what you do at the most efficient and most cost-efficient manner. It's the addition to technology. Cultural and organizational means are necessary, like the entrepreneurial culture. We see the entrepreneurial culture innovating as being an innovative component, where somebody gets an idea and develops it rather than sort of passing it on to somebody else. They take it on themselves. A democratic government, presence of well-educated workforce. Now, some of the problems might be, well, where does or how do we protect workers in these sort of more enterprising networks? Is there a place for a union? What happens with individual rights and responsibilities to this whole process? So as much as there's new organizations of the future, we don't really know exactly what implications that will have, just that this seems to be the direction that some of organizations are starting to move. Well, I hope this has been useful for you. I hope it's been helpful. Take care, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.